Right now, somewhere, someone is thinking about you. Not in the passing way people think about a grocery list or what to watch tonight. In a heavier way. A way that keeps returning, uninvited, at the exact moments they were trying to focus on something else. You may already sense this. A feeling that lingers even when there's no evidence for it, no message, no call. Nothing you could point to and call proof. Just a quiet certainty that you haven't left their mind the way you assumed you would. Carl Jung spent decades studying why certain connections refuse to fade the way ordinary ones do. Why some people occupy space in someone's thoughts long after logic says they shouldn't. His answer wasn't romantic in the way most people expect. It was psychological. And once you understand it, you may find yourself looking at someone in your life very differently. There are 3 reasons someone can't stop thinking about you. 2 of them are things you did, without ever meaning to. The 3rd one has nothing to do with you at all, and it's the one most people never see coming. Before we get into them, it helps to understand why this matters so much to get right. Most explanations for why someone thinks about you constantly tend to fall into one of 2 extremes. Either they're purely flattering, you're simply unforgettable, special, impossible to move on from, which feels nice to hear but explains nothing useful. Or they lean cynical, they're just bored, or lonely, or looking for a backup option, which tends to say more about the person offering the explanation than the situation itself. Neither extreme holds up particularly well under real psychological scrutiny. What Jung's work offers instead is something more precise and, honestly, more useful, because it doesn't require you to guess at someone else's character. It asks a different question entirely. Not are they a good person or a bad person, but what is actually happening psychologically when one person becomes difficult for another person to stop thinking about. That question has real, identifiable answers. Let's go through them. Let's start with the first. The first reason is this. You made them feel like themselves. This sounds simple, almost too simple to explain something as intense as what we're describing, but it's rarer than people realize, and far more powerful than it first appears. Most people spend enormous energy managing how they're perceived, performing competence at work, performing ease in social situations, performing a version of confidence that doesn't always match what's happening underneath. This isn't dishonesty, it's just what most human interaction requires. We adjust, we filter, we present a slightly curated version of ourselves depending on who's in front of us. Then, occasionally, someone comes along in whose presence that performance quietly stops being necessary. Not because you ask them to be different, simply because something about the way you listened, the way you responded, the way you didn't flinch at whatever they revealed, made the performance feel unnecessary. Jung wrote extensively about the persona, the mask each of us builds to interact with the world, useful and even necessary, but exhausting to maintain constantly. When someone finds a person around whom the mask can come down, even slightly, something happens that goes far deeper than ordinary liking. They experience something close to relief, and relief once felt is very hard to forget. This is why they think about you at strange times, not because you did anything remarkable in the traditional sense, because in your presence, something in them exhaled, and the nervous system remembers relief the way it remembers danger, vividly, and for a long time. If you've ever wondered why someone who barely reaches out still seems somehow deeply affected by you, this may be the answer. They are not thinking about a performance you gave. They are thinking about the version of themselves that got to exist, briefly, without armor. There's a reason this specific kind of impact tends to outlast almost everything else in memory. Most interactions leave behind information. What was said, what happened, small factual residue that fades with time the way facts usually do. But the feeling of being unguarded doesn't fade the same way, because it isn't stored as information. It's stored as a bodily sense of relief, and the body holds on to relief with a stubbornness the conscious mind doesn't always share. Someone can forget the specifics of what you talked about entirely, and still carry, months later, an unexplainable sense of ease whenever your name comes up. This is also why this kind of connection is so hard to replace with someone else, even for a person who is actively trying to move on. You cannot manufacture the sense of being unguarded through effort. It either happens or it doesn't, and once someone has experienced it with a specific person, other connections that lack it can start to feel, by comparison, subtly incomplete, even if nothing about those other connections is actually wrong. It's worth pausing here to notice something important about this first reason, because it applies just as much to you as it does to them. If someone made you feel unguarded too, if being around them quieted something in you that usually stays on alert, that's not a small detail either. That's the same mechanism, running in both directions. Two people who each feel more like themselves around the other are not simply compatible in some abstract sense. They found something genuinely rare, and rare things tend to leave a much longer trace in memory than ordinary ones. Now, the second reason is different, and slightly more uncomfortable, because it involves something most people don't like to admit about themselves. The second reason is this: you represent something they haven't let themselves have. Think about the people who occupy the most space in your own memory. Often, they're not the people who gave you everything easily. They're the people connected to something you wanted, but didn't fully allow yourself to pursue. A risk you didn't take. A version of your life you glimpsed, but didn't choose. Human memory holds on to unresolved things far more tightly than it holds on to resolved ones. The same is often true in reverse. If you represent warmth to someone who has spent years being guarded, or spontaneity to someone who has organized their entire life around control, or emotional honesty to someone who has built a career out of composure, you are not simply a person to them anymore. You have become a symbol of a version of life they haven't let themselves live. This is a heavier thing to carry than most people realize, and it explains a specific kind of confusing behavior. Someone who seems drawn to you and simultaneously resistant to you is very often fighting exactly this. Wanting what you represent, while also fearing what wanting it would require them to change. Carl Jung described projection as the process by which we place unclaimed parts of ourselves onto another person, often without realizing we're doing it. You become, in their mind, a kind of embodiment of the freedom, softness, or honesty they've denied themselves. And it's very difficult to stop thinking about someone who has become a symbol for the life you secretly wish you were living. There's a particular irony worth naming here. The very qualities that make someone unforgettable to a guarded person are usually the qualities that guarded person has spent years quietly admiring from a distance, in other contexts too, in friends, in strangers, in characters in books or films, without ever fully naming what they were responding to. When those qualities show up embodied in one specific, available, real person, the response is rarely mild. It tends to be intense precisely because it's been building, unnoticed, for a long time before you ever arrived. This doesn't mean you're responsible for their unlived life. It means their fixation on you may have less to do with who you actually are, and more to do with what your presence makes visible about the choices they haven't made yet. This particular reason explains one of the more painful patterns people experience in situations like this: the sense of being wanted and kept at a distance at the same time, seemingly by the same person, in the same breath. It feels contradictory, because, emotionally, it is. Wanting the thing you represent and fearing the change it would require are not mutually exclusive. They can, and often do, exist simultaneously in the same person, pulling in opposite directions with roughly equal force. This is also why logic tends to fail so completely in these situations. You cannot reason someone out of this kind of internal conflict by being more available, more patient, or more clearly wonderful. Because the obstacle was never a lack of information about your worth. The obstacle is the size of the change that fully choosing you would represent in their own life. That's not a puzzle you can solve from the outside. It's an internal negotiation only they can finish. And now, the third reason. The one that surprises almost everyone, because it doesn't involve anything you did at all. The third reason is this. Some connections activate something older than the relationship itself. Jung believed the human mind carries patterns that extend beyond individual experience, inherited emotional templates shaped by history, culture, and early attachment that get activated by certain people almost instantly, before any real information has been exchanged. He called the deepest layer of this the collective unconscious, populated by what he termed archetypes, recurring patterns of meaning that show up across nearly every culture and story humans have ever told. You don't need to accept every detail of that theory to notice something true within it. Certain people feel instantly significant in a way that has nothing to do with how long you've known them. A stranger can feel more familiar in one conversation than people you've known for years. That familiarity isn't always about the two of you specifically. Sometimes it's about what you activate in each other, older patterns, older wounds, older longings. Meeting for what feels like the first time, but is actually far more layered than that. If someone can't stop thinking about you, and the feeling seems disproportionate to how much time you've actually spent together, this may be part of the answer. You didn't just enter their present. You may have quietly touched something from much earlier in their story, a version of safety, or loss, or belonging that existed long before you did. This is not mystical, even though it can feel that way. It's psychological. The mind is constantly making associations beneath conscious awareness, and certain people simply trigger more of those associations than others. When that happens, the resulting feeling is intense, hard to explain, and very difficult to switch off. This is often why some connections feel instantly weighty in a way that seems to skip several ordinary stages of getting to know someone. Most relationships build gradually. Comfort first, then trust, then depth, each stage earned through repeated contact over time. Certain connections seem to bypass that sequence almost entirely, arriving at something that feels like depth within the first few real conversations. That speed can feel thrilling, and it can also feel destabilizing, especially for someone who prefers to feel in control of how quickly they let people in. When the internal experience moves faster than a person's usual defenses are built to handle, distance often becomes the nervous system's way of trying to slow things back down to a pace that feels manageable. So here is where these three reasons leave us. If someone can't stop thinking about you, it likely isn't because of any single grand gesture, and it likely isn't going to resolve itself through more effort on your part. It's usually some combination of these three things: the relief of being fully themselves around you, the unlived life you've come to represent, and the older, deeper patterns your presence happens to activate. None of that is something you can manufacture, and none of it is something you need to chase harder to secure. What it does mean is this: if you've sensed that lingering, unexplained pull from someone, you are very likely right to trust it. That doesn't obligate them to act on it, and it doesn't obligate you to wait indefinitely for them too. But it does mean you weren't imagining something out of nothing. Whatever this connection is, it has substance, even in the silence. It's worth adding one more thing here, because it's easy to hear all of this and slide into a kind of quiet waiting, telling yourself that if they're truly thinking about you this much, surely it will eventually turn into something. Sometimes it does. But being thought about constantly is not the same thing as being chosen consistently, and it's important not to confuse the two, no matter how much the first one can feel like proof of the second. Being on someone's mind requires nothing from them: no risk, no vulnerability, no change to their daily life. It can coexist comfortably with someone doing absolutely nothing about it, for years, if they choose to. Being chosen is different. It requires action, showing up, communicating clearly, being willing to be uncomfortable in service of the connection. If what you're experiencing is only the first of these, it's worth being honest with yourself about that, gently, without turning it into self-blame. You are allowed to want both. You are allowed to decide how long you're willing to have only one. Carl Jung's work, more than almost anything else, points toward one central idea. We are shaped far more by what we haven't faced than by what we have. If someone thinks about you constantly and still keeps their distance, that contradiction isn't really about you. It's about everything they haven't yet worked out within themselves. Understanding that won't necessarily bring them closer, but it might finally let you stop asking what's wrong with you and start seeing the situation for what it actually is. There's a kind of peace available here that doesn't depend on knowing how this ends. It comes from simply understanding the mechanics of what's happening clearly enough that you're no longer at the mercy of every unanswered message or unexplained silence. You can hold space for someone's complexity without losing yourself inside it. You can care about their inner conflict without making it the center of your own life. That distinction, small as it sounds, changes everything about how a situation like this actually feels to live inside. Stay open to what's real. But don't confuse being thought about with being chosen. Those are two different things, and you deserve the second one, fully and without having to wonder. If this helped you understand something you've been carrying for a while, that's exactly what this was made for.